Um, Given that this will be the last class for a few weeks, and we'll embark on another kind of, I think we'll embark on a discussion of the liturgy, the structure of the services, and first Matins and Vespers and the other services, and then get into the Divine Liturgy for the next kind of series. So this class will bring this series to an end. And one of the things I was thinking about, but I want to ask you what you would like me to talk about, was talking about where we are right now as the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia in the 21st century in America. And what is the religious landscape, and how did we get there? Is that good?
Interesting, yeah.
Okay. We left off last week essentially talking about the schism between Rome and Orthodoxy. Remember that the Filioque controversy, which started in the 6th century with the addition to the Creed, there were two problems with it. One was they didn't have the authority to do it. Two, it lent itself to problematic interpretation. Not necessarily heretical, but still problematic. In the 9th century, Constantine, or rather Charles the Great, Charlemagne, switched his allegiance and was crowned by Rome, the Pope of Rome, and while he was being viewed as a pretender to the throne of the Roman Empire, in the West they saw it as a kind of a restoration, the beginning of several incarnations of a Holy Roman Empire. Didn't last very long. There were all sorts of problems. Charlemagne himself wasn't even literate, but it kind of was what it was. It wasn't until the 11th century that the Filioque was ever used in Rome. It was even declared heretical, or declared as unorthodox, rather, not formally heretical, but unorthodox, by at least one pope, Nicholas, in the Council of 869, after the Phodian controversy. But what happened there was this very gradual alienation between the East and the West. The East became more and more preoccupied with the invasion of the Muslims, and because they were losing vast parts of their empire. The West was not very important to them in the first place. It was economically not at all important to them. These little vassal kingdoms in the midst of chaos. So the Byzantines basically didn't pay much attention to what was going on in the West after about the year 575, probably, or 600. There were very few people who could speak both Greek and Latin. Those who spoke Latin in the West, for the most part, could not speak Greek, and the Greeks in the East regarded those who didn't speak Greek as barbarians. In fact, the word barbarian essentially means babble. Those who babble, because they don't speak Greek. Some things never die. In the West, they didn't exactly appreciate the attitude of the Greeks, because they were kind of doing the best they could to survive, but that was really all they could do. They were just trying to survive. There were some very interesting things that went on historically, with the development of the Benedictine order, the Benedictine monasteries, the growth of the monastic power within the church, bringing some order to the chaos. And then in the 11th century, the ascendancy of a German to the papal throne, the first German. Actually, from the time of the fall of Rome to the barbarians, and especially during the time that from 550 up until Charlemagne, almost all the popes were Greeks. That's why Gregorian chant and Byzantine chant at that stage were virtually indistinguishable. They were just very close, kind of variants of one another. And the life of the church too. I mean, although Rome had its own liturgical rites, so did Lyon, so did Arles, so did Aachen, so did Canterbury. So all the great centers of the West had their own liturgical rites. But so did the churches of the East. Although in the East things were a little bit more unified. There was no real liturgical uniformity until the printing press. But here again, in the West, the liturgy was going on in Latin. All the scholarship was going on in Latin. People were. It was an entirely kind of insular Latin world within the church. And then there were these other languages that the people spoke. But Latin was a unifying force.
I've heard that even in Russia they would study in the seminary in Latin.
Right, but this is hundreds of years before that. Then we get to the 11th century, and the 11th century really marked radical change. That was the time of the mutual excommunication event of the Byzantine emperor and patriarch by the Pope, but the Pope died while the emissary Hummer was in transit, and so it was his excommunication papers were essentially null and void because the Pope was dead, who issued those. It is kind of interesting that in Britain they disagreed with the papacy for excommunicating the East and trying to bring the East under Roman domination, and so what they got was William the Conqueror, who removed all of the rebellious English hierarchy and put faithful Frenchmen into all of the ecclesiastical offices. But in the East, they didn't pay any attention to the Pope. They had much more important things to do. There's this barbarian, who they thought was essentially like this, Charlemagne. Essentially, they would probably characterize as some guy running around we would think like a Neanderthal running around in skins and furs and thinking that he was the Byzantine emperor and laughing at it. It was just so. But in the meantime, by this time, the Slavic mission had gone out, and Christianity was taking root among the Slavs. Starting, the Pope sent Kirill and Methodius into Moravia, and they translated the text. They created the Slavonic language. They created a writing system, and it just spread like wildfire. So that by the turn of the 10th century or the 11th century, most of the Slavic lands had embraced Christianity. The Balkans, Ukraine, and it was moving up from there. Don't forget also that the river system, there were huge trade routes going up and down the rivers, all the way from the Baltic into the Black Sea through Constantinople. And so there was a lot of movement and there was a lot of communication. Of course, the Rus, who occupied Kiev, who were actually Vikings, it became a very powerful force for the propagation of the Orthodox faith. But already there was this kind of tension between the East and the West. And it wasn't too long before you had the Teutonic Knights and all of that. I think in the 13th century with Alexander Nevsky. 13th century, right?
Yes.
Yeah, with Alexander Nevsky. Watch the movie. It's worthwhile.
Yes.
So that even the very earliest years of the church, of the church in the Slavic lands, there was a sense that of an Orthodox Eastern identity as opposed to a Catholic Western identity, and there was resistance against the Latin missionaries, the Germans who were coming to essentially take land.
In what sense was there resistance? Just
The Teutonic Knights?
the resistance military?
No. There was a kind of a cultural resistance. The people were developing an Orthodox identity as opposed to over against a Catholic identity.
So they would ostracize them. They would shun them when they would try and come into the.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then, of course, there was also a military incursion at the same time.
Oh.
So anyway, there's a lot of history. There were a couple of the schism. 1054 was a kind of a non-event, but you still hear about it. But the real schism occurred in 1204. Remember, I talked about this with the creation of a parallel hierarchy in Constantinople, where the Latins refused to recognize the Greek hierarchy, the local hierarchy, and instead they installed a Latin bishop in Hagia Sophia, and cast the Greeks out, exiled them to Nicaea. The Greeks came back in 1264, but by that time, much of the Byzantine state, or the Eastern Roman Empire, had been whittled down into a very small area. Most of it gobbled up either by Muslims on one hand, or by Crusader kingdoms on the other. Most of the Aegean, most of Greece was Crusader kingdoms. Most of Turkey, or what we now call Turkey, Asia Minor, was dominated by the Turks, and the Balkan and the Turks had gone and gobbled up most of the Balkans, Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia. So there was this huge clash of cultures going on. The Byzantine, Roman, ancient Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, the Western Empire under the Germans, and the Ottoman Empire, or the Ottoman Caliphate, rather, of the Turks. So all of this were vying for power. The only really free area of the Orthodox communities were in Ukraine and Russia, because those empires really didn't penetrate either that far east or that far north.
Why not Vladika?
Why not? They just didn't go there.
They didn't feel it was worth it.
Too cold.
It was probably too. It was probably too cold and too wild. There were attempts. For example, the daughter of the Byzantine emperor married the son of the Kievan prince. And so that kind of thing was going on. So that Kiev essentially became a vassal state to Constantinople. But as Constantinople descended into chaos, a lot of that really just didn't work. Those relationships didn't work. And so with this alienation, you know, and with most of the South being swallowed up in the Islamic domination, the Ukrainians, Russians were kind of left to themselves. The Rus. Rus is a kind of a blanket category that covers everybody from Belarus to Ukraine to Russia to. But they had their Orthodox origins in Kiev under Vladimir. The Kievan Empire was conquered by the Mongols and the Tartars, and that was finally freed in the 14th century. And then there were all sorts of struggles, and at the end of the 17th century, you had the beginning of the Romanov dynasty. And which actually persecuted the church. In the middle of the 17th century, you had the old believer controversy. You probably heard about that. At the time, they went and in the Russian church they decided to harmonize the liturgical texts of the Russian church with the current Greek texts. And so they had the Greek texts retranslated into Slavonic. And so they corrected all the liturgical texts. Well, the old believers didn't want the correction. They didn't want the correction according to the contemporary Greek practice. And so they broke off. And at one point it was like 25% of the Russian church. And that ended in all sorts of tragedy. You can read all about it. In the Romanov dynasty, we had Peter the First. In the monastic world, Peter is not referred to as Peter the Great. He's Peter the First, and the first great persecutor of the Orthodox Church. And he and his successors of the Romanov dynasty, throughout the 18th and into the early 19th century, persecuted the church. They seized all the lands. They seized which was the income for the church. They removed the patriarch. They did all of these things. Instead, Peter, who was entranced with the German and the Dutch cultures, substituted a synod with a lay appointed Oberprocurator, who actually was in control of the church. And so the Russian church in the 18th and 19th centuries was quite a mess. It was quite a mess. Now,
was not the king the chief of the church?
Pardon?
Was not the king the chief of the church?
No.
Never?
No. In the Orthodox model, you have a two-headed eagle. The king and the patriarch. And
but when the patriarch was removed,
then the patriarch was removed, and instead
the
one head bit off the other, but there was an appointed imperial official. And that was basically a Lutheran kind of model. We're fast forwarding through history. The 19th century, or end of the 18th century, was a very significant time for the Russian Orthodox Church. Starting in the beginning of the 17th century, there was this huge push of conquest by the Russians all the way to the Pacific. So that the basic outlines of the current borders of Russia were there by the end of the 18th century. With them, there were missionaries who went out. and converted the people to Orthodoxy, because one of the most important unifying factors within the Russian Empire was Orthodox Christianity. And it was the same vision as in Byzantium. You had a single nation with a single religion with a single czar or Caesar or emperor, or whatever you want to call them. But it's this very kind of unified vision of society. And so to fully incorporate all of these people, many became Orthodox. Now, most of them were pagans that converted. So that by the end of the 19th century, the liturgy was being celebrated just in the Russian Empire in 120 different languages, just within the Russian Empire. People were not forced to convert, but of course it was politically expedient to. On the other hand, many people, freely accepted the gospel. When the empire moved across the Bering Sea and into Alaska and all the way down to San Francisco, was claimed as Russian territory. The missionaries came as well, and the most important foundation of the church in America, the ecclesiastical foundation, came when the Metropolitan of St. Petersburg, in cooperation with Abbot St. Nazari of Valon, sent 10 monks on a mission to establish a missionary monastery in Alaska to convert the Americans, specifically with the agenda to convert the Alaskans, the natives, American natives. So far as they were concerned, they didn't care what language or what ethnicity the people were. And this is one of the great differences between the Spanish missions, which viewed the natives as semi-human, as opposed to the Russians, who, simply wanted to include them fully into the empire as citizens. Even though one certainly has to say that a lot of the Russian merchants badly mistreated the Native Americans, the Aleuts and so forth. Still, they didn't dehumanize them in quite the way the Spanish did, the Indians of California and other places. This mission that started at Valon Monastery, which is it's not on this map. It's further north. The monks essentially walked and took rafts and boats all the way across Siberia to the coast, where they got on a ship and went from the Kamchatka Peninsula all the way over to Kodiak, and they established a church and a monastery in Kodiak, Holy Resurrection Church, which is still there. What's that?
What year was this?
This was 1794. They left in 1793. It took them an entire year to get across Siberia. There was the Archimandrite Yosef, who was the head of the mission, and one of the most significant monks was a very simple monk, not a priest, not a deacon, by the name of Herman. And Father Herman had been selected because of his spiritual maturity and that he could provide a spiritual foundation for the mission. There was also Saint Macari, who became a martyr, and several others. 9 all told, I think, 9 or 10. So they got to Kodiak. They built a complex. They were aided by the Russian American company, which was a trading company, which basically traded the products of the New World, mainly furs, and for cash in Russia, because seal pelts and things like that, otter pelts, were very highly valued in Russia. And the monks were sent out. Some of the monks, the priest monks, were sent out as missionaries. Makary was sent out, and he took the area going up into mainland Alaska, Lake Iliamna, and according to the natives, he made it all the way to the mouth of the Yukon River, where they thought he was a shaman because he was wearing a chain. Evidently, shamans wore chains. And the natives shot him with arrows and then cut him up into little pieces. He and a companion. It was only many generations later that the natives kind of sheepishly admitted that yes, they had mistaken this missionary for a shaman and killed him.
What's a shaman?
A shaman? A shaman is a kind of a in certain forms of native religion. A shaman is somebody who becomes possessed by spirits or has a spirit helper, and then is the kind of healer and holy man for a particular tribe. Okay. They also studied a lot of herbology and healing kind of things. But they were also known because of their a lot of the religion centered around this kind of ecstatic possession by spirits, and they would lead the dances and things like that. Anyway, he had succeeded in preaching the gospel in southern Alaska, but because he was killed and nobody knew what happened to him for a long time, it was not much developed out of that. However, the Aleutians were evangelized first by the Russian traders themselves, who went through and baptized people, and then the priests eventually came through and they married and blessed and married people and all of these kinds of things. Later on, baptized children and chrismated them and all. But not a lot of churches appeared out of that first mission. A few. But the mission stretched all the way from the islands, which are just off the coast of Siberia, all the way across the Bering Sea to Kodiak and into continental Alaska. In about 1798, the monks got fed up with the Russians, and they went on strike because the Russians were being obnoxious to the natives and mistreating them, and while the missionaries were there trying to convert them and to and treat them as people, whereas the Russian merchants were basically using and abusing them. So they refused. The missionaries refused to do any sacraments for the Russians, to do any public services, to do anything for them. And Archimandrite Yosaf, who was the head of the mission, went back to St. Petersburg in order to report. They decided to make him a bishop, and they sent him back. And as his boat was nearing Kodiak in 1799, on his return, after his having been made bishop for the Americas, the first bishop, it sank in a storm. So he died, never being able to set foot on his new territory. About the same time, some of the other missionaries were not so happy with the situation, and things did not go well. And St. Herman, in particular, was very frustrated with the Russians, and so he withdrew to an island across the bay from Kodiak, an island called Spruce Island, where he went back to living as a hermit. He lived as a hermit on Valom. I've been to the site of his cabin, and his field is called St. Herman's Field. And he, built a little cabin and said his prayers and lived in the wilderness. Well, and ministered to the local people. Well, at this time, the Americans started sailing up the west coast, and for some reason, the Russians didn't bring a whole lot of disease with them, but the Americans did. And so there were these vast epidemics that swept through the population, just like there had been throughout most of North America. It wasn't quite as virulent as it had been in the South. In the South and in the East, in this area, for example, the diseases that they brought were 95% mortality rate. If you can imagine, 95% mortality rate. Some of the earliest explorers, the first explorers, in their journals, they went up the Mississippi and they saw vast cities of Native Americans, which there were vast cities, and but 50 years later, there was nothing, just wilderness. When the first explorers hit the East Coast, the entire East Coast was populated with little villages and fields for 20 miles in from the coast. All fields, forest completely cleared, and little villages every mile or two. 20 years later, there was one native who had been taken to England, and he came back having learned English and becoming a translator. He went to his home village, and he literally found piles of bones of his relatives.
What were the diseases?
First, it was smallpox, and then influenza. Influenza in particular, because these people had no immunity. These were particularly European diseases, and there had been no contact from Europe for centuries. So
why did Europeans get diseases from the Native Americans?
They did syphilis.
Oh, okay.
And the syphilis-related spirochetes, or Native American viral strain. So they had their revenge, but nothing. We think of Native Americans as very simple people living, as just hunter-gatherers and things like that. But really, what they were is they were refugees from destroyed civilizations. If you can imagine. So these same diseases also swept through Alaska, and they only had about a 30 to 50% mortality rate. So all the old people, all the young, a lot of the young got sick. Those who recovered, of course, became immune. But there were huge numbers of orphans, There are huge numbers of people that needed to be ministered to, and Saint Herman in particular ministered to these people and became utterly beloved by them. He was also credited with stopping a tidal wave. There was an earthquake. Everybody knew there was going to be a tidal wave because that's how it goes up there. And he took an icon, placed it on the beach, and said that the wave will not come further than this. And it came right up to the icon. So, I mean, there's lots of stories. And the native people up there still love St. Herman. And if you go to the place where he lived on Spruce Island, it's a place still permeated with his prayers. And it was the native people of Alaska that were the most important in pushing his canonization as their beloved father, Herman. And so, which is very interesting, because if you compare that to what happened with the Spanish and Junipero Serra, it was the Native Americans who objected the most strenuously to his canonization. So anyway, St. Herman lived as a hermit, basically, on Spruce Island from about the year 1800, 1799, 1800, until his death in 1837. Now, I think you've probably read about St. Seraphim of Sarov or heard of him? Okay. Elder Nazari, who was St. Herman's spiritual father, was also the spiritual father for St. Seraphim. And they probably knew each other. St. Herman also brought with him a copy of the Philokalia, which was newly translated into Slavonic. And it's I've seen his copy. It's this huge volume, not that thick. And so he truly lived a traditional hesychast life, serving the poor, and trying to civilize the Russians. You know, they went there with the idea of civilizing the Native Americans, and instead the monks ended up trying to civilize the Russians. A few years later, and while there weren't a whole lot of churches established by that first mission, there were many people that were truly converted to Christ. And then a few years later, you had two men arise that were extremely important for the American mission. One was Father John Veniaminov, who became Saint Innocent, and the other was Father Yakov Nitzvedov, who became the great missionary saint of Alaska. Saint Innocent was a seminarian in Irkutsk. Of course, Saint Yakov, or Jacob, James, whatever, had been sent to Irkutsk. He was a native, half Russian, half Aleutian, from one of the far Aleutian islands. He was sent to Russia to go to seminary in Irkutsk, and I wonder if he and Saint Innocent knew each other. Yakov took a Russian wife, and Father and Veniaminov also took a wife, ended up having 5 children, and he took his wife, his 5 children, and his mother-in-law on the mission to the Aleutian Islands. And Saint Yakov brought his wife, and I don't know who else, and he was on the next island. He's in the Aleutians, right? Way out in the middle of the Bering Sea. So they were the closest neighbors, only about 200 miles apart. And eventually, Father Saint Innocent who was a very handy kind of guy. He built buildings, he built clocks, he built organs, he built, all sorts of things. Was also a zealous missionary. He learned the Aleutian language, he gave it a written form, and he wrote a book in it, aside from translating the gospel and the services into Aleut. And he traveled around the Aleutian Islands as a missionary, preaching, teaching, baptizing, marrying, people. There's a remarkable story of on one of these islands where the shaman of the island was told by his spirits that there would be this man who would be coming, who described him and said, you must listen to everything and do exactly what he says because he brings you the truth. And so St. Innocent traveled by kayak. They had a special kayak made. Aleuts are little guys. They're only about a little over 5 feet tall. And St. Innocent was almost 7 feet tall. So he was a big guy, to say the least.
Wow.
And he had a special kayak made for him. And so he paddled from island to island in his kayak. That, of course, didn't help his legs later on because the water outside was 33 degrees. And eventually he developed real heavy arthritis. But you can imagine how long it would take to paddle 200 miles between islands. And the Bering Sea is full of whirlpools. It's full of, whales and sharks and all sorts of things. Anyway, so he pulls up to this island, and of course there's absolutely no way that there could be any pre-notification that he was coming. But the entire village was standing on the beach waiting for him and greeted him by name. And
no internet?
No internet, no cell phones, no landlines, and no carrier pigeons either. So he comes and and the shaman goes up to him and says, we've been waiting for you. We were told that you're coming, and we want to hear what you have to say, and we want to accept the message that you've come to bring us. Pretty remarkable. And in general, among the Alaskan natives, they were extremely receptive to the gospel. Extremely receptive to the gospel. St. Innocent later on, he tried to investigate who these spirits were that were talking to this shaman, because they were, these spiritual beings, in radiant white robes and things like that. So he figured that they were probably angels, but I don't think he ever got a definitive answer from the church higher ups. But they prepared the people for the gospel, and so the people were baptized. And so to this day, all the Aleutian Islands, most of Kodiak, and the entire southern half of Alaska are primarily Orthodox. You've got the Aleut people, you've got the Kodiak people, who are a kind of combination between Aleut and Yupik Eskimo. Then you've got the Yupik Eskimos on the south of the Yukon River and going in a little bit. And then inside you've got the Athabaskan people on the interior of Alaska. And then from Sitka on down for a ways you have the Tlingit people, all of whom are extremely different. This Tlingit, T-L-I-N-G-I-T.
Tlingit.
They're like these their culture is like one of these cultures that produces this classic Northwest coast, the totem poles and and the really wonderful art and very high advanced culture. Ethnically, it's very interesting. I said Aleuts are small, really small people. They're very small, very compact, and very peaceful. Yupiks are also small and compact for the most part, a little bit bigger than Aleuts, but also very peaceful people. The Athabascans are Indians. The Aleuts, the Yupiks, and the Kodiak Aleuts are actually more Eskimo, are Eskimo people, meaning that it's a very late migration. And in fact, the Eskimos continue to go back and forth between Asia and North America. And in the far north with the Inuits, it's still a single culture on northern Siberia and northern Alaska, all the way to Greenland. But the Orthodox never got up. Missionaries never got up to the Inuit. So the Yupik on down. The Tlingits are huge. They're more than 6 feet high. Compared to a 5 foot tall Aleut, that's a big difference. They're heavy. They're extremely warlike, and very aggressive culture. Whereas the Aleuts and the Yupiks are very passive. There's a wonderful story about contemporary Yupiks, actually. Their cultures are very similar. The languages are related. This friend of mine was up there, and he got a call from these Yupik friends who wanted to come over and visit. And so they came in very quietly and sat down and sat there. And my friend, who was white guy from the States, didn't quite know what to do, because they just sat there. And then after an hour or so, they said, "Oh, thank you very much. This was a wonderful visit." Got up and left. Okay, not our culture. So the other really significant person along with Saint Innocent in the evangelization of Alaska was Saint Jacob or Yaakov. He was the first Native American priest born of American stock, and first Native American, first American. He was Saint Innocent's neighbor on the next island, so they would get together periodically. Saint Innocent's wife died, and I think his kids were taken under imperial protection, and they made him a bishop. So he became the first bishop of America to actually live in America. And he knew that there were the Yupiks up there who needed evangelizing. So he took his old friend, Father Yaakov, who was an old guy by this time. He was 50, which in those kind of conditions, 50 is, quite mature, quite elderly, and assigned him to go and to the Yupiks, to the Yukon River. Now, that's a lot further north, and it's a totally different kind of environment, and the Yupiks and the Aleuts were traditional enemies. So, Saint Yaakov goes and he establishes a mission there, and these are the people who had killed the previous missionary, but they accepted his They accepted him. They accepted the gospel. They became Orthodox Christians, and he was there for 10 years or more. But about 10 years into it, so he was already 60, which is really old in that kind of environment. There was these canoes came down the Yukon full of Athabascans. Now, the Athabascans and the Yupiks were traditional enemies. But they came to Father Yaakov, who himself was an Aleut, and said, "You've been here now for all of these years, and you have not come and told us your stories. We demand that you come with us and tell us your stories." So they took him 400 miles up the river in their canoes. Of course, the Yukon is huge. It's the size of the Mississippi. And they put him in a house, told him to wait. And, one of their houses, they built pit houses. So they were dug out, and then they built a structure up on top. Nice and warm and cozy, and so far as that culture goes. And so he looked out and he saw people convening from all different directions, and thousands of people of all these different bands and tribes of Athabascan people convened on this place to hear him preach. And speaking through a translator, he preached for 3 days. Then he baptized for 3 days straight, so that the Athabascans became Orthodox Christians, and they still are. Later, St. Innocent decided, well, enough hardship duty for Father Yaakov, and so he sent him not back home, but to Sitka, to the colonial capital, to work with the Tlingits, where, just as St. Innocent had done, and as he had done for the Yupiks, he learned the language, he wrote it down for the first time, he translated the books, he translated the scriptures, he translated the liturgy. And so St. Yaakov is venerated as the evangelizer of the Alaskan peoples. Incredible great missionary.
Can you spell Yaakov for me, please?
Jacob. Jacob.
Don't you wonder what they ate?
What about
What they
Salmon.
drank? Salmon. Did they eat anything but that?
Seals
it was?
and walruses.
Predominantly protein.
Yeah.
So everything he was telling was just oral, right? They didn't know how to write. People there, they didn't know how to read or write, right?
Oh no! They didn't speak any European language.
No, I mean he
They
was
had a
telling
written
them
language.
in their language.
No, it was not a written language.
It was not, so it's
So how did they
something
translate?
that was just telling from generation to generation. I
Right.
mean,
It was all
Right.
oral. It was
oh,
completely oral culture, and the Russian missionaries gave them written language. So today, Aleut and Yupik are still written with. They're not transliterated in English, but they use Russian, a basic Russian kind of alphabet.
do they use Slavonic?
No,
No.
actually, they use the native language. They use their own language
Their
for the
own.
services. I mean, there were a few hymns that they learned in Slavonic, but for the most part, with the Aleuts, it was in Aleutian. With the Yupiks, it was in Yupik. This pattern of missionization was what the Russians did throughout their empire, because the criterion for them was not speaking Russian. The criterion for them was to be a Russian citizen was to be an Orthodox Christian, and so you still have the saying, if you're Orthodox, you're Russian. That doesn't work with the Greeks. for
Even
example.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he's Russian Orthodox.
Absolutely. Just look at the icons. Blonde hair, blue eye.
Yeah.
Right off the steps of Ukraine. So Saint Yaakov is obviously one of the greatest saints, and Alaska is the foundation of Orthodoxy in America, both ecclesiastically as well as in mission. And what's very important to remember is that there were really only a handful of Russian missionaries. It was mainly the native people themselves that spread the faith and established the churches.
They were happy to have something in common with one another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what united them was the same faith.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a and the other thing that Orthodoxy has, if you haven't noticed it, it's there's kind of an ethnic component to most of Orthodoxy. What it does is that speaking as in anthropological terms, is the church provides a context for the continuation and for the preservation of the culture. It gets reinterpreted into Christian forms, but there's never a kind of a syncretism, such as happened in a lot of the Spanish areas in Mexico, where you may have this some Spanish saint, but then behind the statue of the saint was the statue of some pagan god, and instead of and they would so the pagan religion continued along with Christianity in a kind of loose, which has turned out to be a disaster in most of Latin America, a lot of Latin America.
I think paganism exists in the Orthodoxy in Russia.
Oh, it does. I mean, it still exists in Greece.
Yeah, exactly. It's the root anyway.
Yeah, but usually don't. Usually with Orthodox Christians, you have people who are. There may be some old superstitions which are survivals from paganism, but usually you don't have a full system of paganism. If somebody's an Orthodox Christian, they renounce that, and they try and live according to the church, even if a few superstitions. I mean, Americans still have Germanic and British superstitions, knocking on wood and things like that. So, Saint Innocent came to America as bishop in 1843. He went initially in 1824 with his family to the island. He came to Sitka in 1843, and he traveled all the way to San Francisco, visiting. There was a fort just north of San Francisco, Fort Ross. Initially, it had been at Bodega Bay, but then for where they located it was more defensible. Fort Ross means Fort Russia, essentially, and it was the southernmost and west and easternmost outpost of the Russian Empire. And if you go to the Spanish mission, which is about 25 miles from there, in Sonoma, you walk into the visitor center. You have a mural on the wall of a Spanish friar confronting a Russian priest monk. Because the reason for the Spanish missions in California, that Junipero Serra was sent to establish these missions, was to try and keep the Russians from taking the entire coast of California, which is very interesting. So San Francisco was basically the dividing line. Spanish below the Golden Gate and Russian above the Golden Gate. And still a lot of the coast was explored by Russian explorers. You've heard of Mount Shasta in California, which is Mount
I don't know
Happiness.
I don't know where it is, but I've heard of it.
It's right in the very middle of the top quarter of Northern California. It's this huge conical volcano. You have the Trinity River. You have, all these things that actually was names given by the Russian explorers. Saint Innocent was able to speak Latin because in the seminaries in Russia at the time they were teaching in Latin in order to be more European. And so he spoke fluent Latin, and he also made a big impression on all the friars and things, the Spanish friars, and he made them organs, barrel organs. And so he made the comment in one of his diaries that the organs actually play merry Russian dance tunes, and here the Spaniards think that they're listening to hymns.
Yes.
And he also, he made clocks and things like that. He visited all over the Bay Area, being from the Bay Area. It's a big deal to the Orthodox of Northern California. So the foundation of Orthodoxy started in Alaska, and it moved down the coast. By 1857, there was a very substantial parish in San Francisco. Now, about the same time, the Greeks established a parish in New Orleans, and there were a couple of other Greek parishes or communities of Greeks that had established churches, but they had no hierarchy. The Russians actually brought the full ecclesiastical hierarchy, and in 1872, the Diocese of North America was established in San Francisco. At that time, there was a kid who was born and raised in that parish by the name of Sebastian Dabovich, and he became the missionary he became the first priest born in the United States. And of course, Russia before that was not part of the United States for the most part. And he established the Serbian church, gathered the Serbian communities all over North America. So he's regarded as kind of the father of the Serbian Orthodox community. And later on, there was so this is bringing us up into the 1880s. There were not many churches. There were a few. The Russians provided the clergy. There was a bishop in San Francisco. There was a bishop in Sitka as well. There was a seminary in Sitka, but already in the 1870s, the liturgy was being served in English, and there was instruction in English in the Orthodox faith. And it was, and the Russian Orthodox mission had the specific intention of converting Americans. But for example, in San Francisco, the parish was largely Greeks and Serbs. But everybody was together. There were a couple of isolated Greek communities, but most of the parishes of the Russian mission were pan-Orthodox. In the mid-1880s, there was a community that was brought over from Slovakia, which was part of the Russian Austro-Hungarian Empire. Huge numbers of Carpatho-Russians and Slovakians who were Eastern Rite Catholics. These were Orthodox from the border of Ukraine and Poland, where the border had shifted to the east, and they'd found themselves in Catholic Poland. And so their bishops left Orthodoxy and went into the Roman Church. So it looked the same, it sounded the same, but it was actually the Roman Catholic Church and not the Orthodox Church. But it was politically incorrect to be in the Polish Catholic Empire and have your allegiance to Moscow, which was the enemy. Anyway, the West Ukrainians are still heavily Uniate. Eastern Rite Catholic is Uniate, in union with Rome, and that's where a lot of the animus against Russia comes from in Ukraine right now. Anyway, so these people came over, and there was a large community that gathered in Minneapolis for some reason. And they built a church and requested a priest from the old country. And they sent over Father Alexis Toth. And Father Alexis was a very venerable old archpriest. He'd been the dean of a seminary. Was a widower, and big guy with a beard and the whole, all dressed up like an Orthodox priest. Well, at the time, the Uniate churches did not have a hierarchy over here separate from the Roman Catholic hierarchy. So the bishop of Minneapolis was a guy named the Roman Catholic bishop was a guy named John Ireland. And he takes a look at this guy, this big, burly, bearded, becassecked, long-haired, formerly married priest, and says, "Get out! I don't want you in my diocese. I don't authorize you to serve the liturgy. Go back to wherever you came from. Go away." Which rather took him and the community by surprise. John Ireland also later on made a very big name for himself in the Roman Catholic Church because there was a whole thing called the Americanist controversy right at the turn of the century. Anyway, so Father Alexis goes back to his community and tells them what happened, and they were all shocked. And somebody says, "Well, I've heard that there's a Russian bishop in San Francisco." So they go to the Russian bishop, whose name was Vladimir at the time, and he presents himself to him and says, "Welcome, welcome home," takes him under his jurisdiction, gives him an antiments, and authorizes him to serve the church and to reunite the the Eastern Catholics to the Orthodox Church.
So he went all the way from Russia to the middle of the United States, then back to Russia, and then back.
No, then to San Francisco.
Oh, okay.
He actually came from Slovakia.
Oh, okay.
Slovakia
Wow.
to Minneapolis. Then he gets rejected in Minneapolis and goes to San Francisco to get the blessing and to be received into the Russian Church. Well, he began a movement of over 300 parishes back from Uniatism into the Orthodox Church.
What?
Uniatism, the Byzantine Catholic.
Oh, okay.
So there was this huge influx into the Russian missionary diocese of Eastern Rite Catholics who were culturally very different than the Russians. Of course, the Russians basically provided the clergy, but the people were, this total mix. So that that created some interesting dynamics. At this time, there was also a large movement of Arabs from Syria into a large immigration of Syrians, and some of these other ethnic groups began to move in mass. The first ones were the Greeks and the Serbs, But the Greeks also had various churches that they had organized separately. Although there were some Greeks within the Russian mission, and some of the Greeks were just independent. They didn't want any bishop. Some of the Greeks were under the bishop of Constantinople, and some of the Greeks were under the bishop in Athens. So the Greeks were in chaos. But the Russians, everything was, basically ecclesiastically kind of laid out and in order.
And they came through Alaska.
Well, the church came through Alaska,
Yeah.
but by this time, most of the immigration was coming through New York.
Yeah, that's why
Yeah.
I'm wondering.
Yeah, and
Because they're way west.
right. So the church came from the west, but the people were coming from the east. And so they kind of,
No.
got together
Long
mostly
way
in the
away.
east. Yeah. Oh, it's 9 o'clock already. Around 1893, I believe, you had a brand new bishop sent from Russia, whose name was Tikhon, and Tikhon took up residence in San Francisco, and was a very zealous missionary. He traveled all over North America, working to establish the church. He transferred the diocese from San Francisco to New York in 1907. Of course, in 1906, San Francisco was obliterated by the earthquake and the fire. And so he laid the foundations for the new cathedral in San Francisco, but it was not practical, and the great bulk of the diocese was now in the east. He had an assistant by the name of Raphael, who was Syrian, who had studied in the Russian theological seminaries, and he had him ordained as a bishop. I believe he was the first bishop consecrated in America, and was given the task to gather the Syrian communities. So he also maintained very close connections with the church in Syria, but was definitely under Tikhon. And St. Tikhon had a vision for the church in America of a united church with a single hierarchy, but with bishops working with different ethnic groups, so that all the ethnic groups would be together in the synod, but each could have their own churches and their own language, and eventually for the American church to be independent. St. Tikhon was taken back to Russia, given a major assignment, and in 1917, on the eve of the revolution, there was a huge council of the church. The Tsar had abdicated, and so the church was free for the first time in 300 years. And there was a universal kind of virtually universal desire to restore the patriarchate, which Peter the Great or Peter the First had removed. And there were also a whole variety of other reforms that were being proposed. One of the greatest leaders of the Russian Church at the time was the Bishop of Kiev, I don't remember, by the name of Anthony Krapovitsky. Volhynia, yeah, which is Western Ukraine. He was one of the most progressive and forward-thinking bishops of the Russian Church. and in organizing this council, pushed for the restoration of the Patriarchate and several different kinds of reforms. It's interesting what some of those reforms were. Now there was a group of clergy that was also that wanted far more radical reforms. But what the council approved in 1917 was the restoration of the Patriarchate, the use of the Russian language instead of Slavonic, the new calendar, a whole list of things. There were three candidates that were generally agreed upon by the assembly for patriarch, and Anthony was one of them, and Tikhon turned out to be another, and Tikhon was chosen to be patriarch just before the Bolshevik coup, which basically took everybody by surprise. It was not. I don't think it was something widely expected in the culture, of course, very soon after the coup, the Bolsheviks started executing people. Now, this council was so important for the life of the church that all the major leaders of the American church, all the senior clergy, were in Moscow for the council, which meant that as the Bolshevik coup became more and more, it created greater and greater chaos in Russia, that the American church was essentially decapitated. And many of the bishops and many of the leading priests were stuck. They couldn't go home. And it also happened that two very leading priests who had done significant work in America, Alexander Hodovitsky and John Kochurov, were among the first martyrs of the Bolshevik by the Bolsheviks, already in early 1918. Along very quickly with many bishops and metropolitans and priests, and some of the clergy were able to return. Others never did. Others were killed. So the American church, which up to this time had been significantly funded by the Tsar and funded by the missionary society that had been started by St. Innocent. St. Innocent, after his time in America, eventually ended up as Metropolitan of Moscow and created a missionary society which funded missionary efforts in the vast Russian Empire, including in America. So the end of the teens, of course, it was a brutal, confusing time. Certainly in Europe, certainly in Russia, with the end of World War I, the Bolshevik coup, the beginning of the Civil War, and the mass murder of the faithful, but also in America, because the leadership was gone, the funding was gone, and you had all of these various ethnic groups, each vying for control, or at least control of their own communities. So what happened you had Saint Tikhon trying to shepherd the church as patriarch. He was soon arrested, imprisoned, and then put under house arrest, and went back and forth between prison and house arrest until he died under, shall we say, questionable circumstances in 1925 on Annunciation. in 1924 he issued an order, just called an ukaz, to the external dioceses of the Russian Church, saying that they had to organize their own lives until they could establish normal patterns of communication, because everything was in chaos. Very few people expected the revolution to take. They thought they went into exile. They thought they'd be home in a year or two, after the communists were overthrown and disappeared and gave up or whatever. Of course, that didn't happen. But in Europe, you had quite a number of bishops, and being led by Anthony Kropotkin, who had gone into exile, who made their way first through Constantinople and finally ended up as guests of the Serbian Church in a place called Karlovci. And they were given churches, they were given freedom by the Serbian Church to organize the affairs of the refugees. And so in Europe, the bishops came together to organize the Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. The American Church also did the same thing. They had the American diocese organized a council, and they declared temporary autonomy. And just as the bishops in Karlovci also essentially operated as an autonomous church, waiting until they could restore normal relations with the Patriarchate. Well, that took a long time. The American Church was a very complicated situation at the time. And there was you had some of these various ethnic groups kind of going their own way. The Serbs went their own way. The Romanians went their own way. They pulled out of this unity. The Greeks formed the Greek Archdiocese in 1922. Before this, because they really hadn't. There was this massive Greek emigration immediately after the Second World War. Remember, after the First World War, there was the exchange of populations between Greece and Turkey. Do you remember hearing about that? All the Greeks were expelled from Turkey, millions and millions of Greeks, and all the Turks were expelled from Greece. So the Turks went back to Turkey, but Greece couldn't absorb all of the millions of Greeks that were thrown out, and also the Armenians were expelled from Turkey. This is the Armenian genocide.
I heard about that.
Yeah. Well, this takes place at the same time as the expulsion of the Greeks.
Oh.
Well, now Greece is a small, poor country, and they couldn't deal with millions of people coming in, and so many of those people came to America. So you had this huge new Greek population that was reeling from their bitter uprooting. The Armenians also came over, and several other, and then there was another immigration from Eastern Europe, and then there were the refugees. There was a huge Russian immigration of refugees fleeing the Bolsheviks. There was, if you remember, there was the Civil War, and there was the White Army fighting against the communists, and basically those who were not killed fled, and because they would be killed otherwise. So some went into the West and Europe, and others. Some people walked all the way to China from Ukraine, and from European Russia. Those that made it to China, and a lot of the, because there were already large established Russian communities in China, in Manchuria, and in Shanghai, where there were huge Russian populations. They were able to absorb many of these people, and many of these people were these were the upper classes, the aristocracy, the merchant classes, basically those who could afford to leave. Same thing in Europe, and it was which was a very different kind of immigration than, say, the Carpatho-Russians who had come over, most of whom were peasants who came over essentially like indentured servants to the mines and to the mills. So very, very, very different people. That created also, and there were all sorts of tensions in America because of that. So the parishes were kind of split in various ways. There were those who were adamantly Tsarist, and ideologically monarchist and the whole bit. Then there were on the other hand, you had the kind of reformists and many of the Carpatho-Russians who had never been Russian, had never been under the Tsar, didn't like Tsars and didn't want empires anymore. They'd only suffered under them. They were basically peasants, and they were very happy to be in a democracy, and they couldn't care less what happened to the Tsar. And then there were the people kind of in the middle. What most of them shared was a absolutely solid commitment to being anti-communist. Absolutely solid commitment. Although there were some who were willing to be faithful to the Patriarchate no matter what. No matter that the Patriarchate eventually accommodated itself to the Soviet government. And then there were those who said they would have nothing to do with the Church that if it accommodated itself to the Soviet government. So all of this politics of the old world got transplanted to the new world among the emigres, and the refugees. I think this accounts for some of the going back and forth that happened over the next 30 or 40 years. 1935, the Moscow Patriarchate sent, in the 20s, there was a group of the radical reformist clergy, not the ones who just wanted the minimal reforms, which were put on hold anyway because of the revolution, but the ones who wanted radical reforms. They wanted to get rid of the iconostas and pull the altar out into the middle of the church, and they wanted married bishops, and they wanted to get rid of monasticism and all this other kind of. So it was like a precursor to Vatican II.
Oh.
But in the Russian Orthodox Church.
Right.
And this group came to be known as the Living Church. So in the early 20s, they were actually they were sponsored by the Communist Party, and the Communist Party pulled recognition of the Patriarchate and of Saint Tikhon and his successors as the recognized official church, and the communist government recognized the Living Church as the official Russian Orthodox Church. And it's interesting that the Patriarchate of Constantinople did the same thing. Of course, leaving St. Tikhon in the lurch. So they came over, and as the now official Russian Orthodox Church, the living church, they began to seize properties, to seize churches. And the faithful people here, most of whom were immigrants.
What do you mean by here?
In America.
Okay.
The faithful people, most of whom were immigrants, didn't want anything to do with these radical reformists in the first place, and these puppets of the Soviet government on the other. So eventually it forced the church in America to adopt certain practices. For example, a lot of churches, like the Roman Catholic Church or even the Greek Orthodox Church, all the property is vested in the name of the bishop. The entire diocese is called corporation sole. But you get a bishop who's appointed by the wrong people, and what happens? All the property goes to him. So that was not acceptable, to say the least. And there was a huge battle, in particular over St. Nicholas Cathedral in New York, that had been built by St. Tikhon on 97th Street. Of the living church versus the Russian mission. In the meantime, all the Greeks and the Serbs and even the Antiochians had kind of gone their own way by this time. So you had these various warring factions. The living church kind of petered out because it didn't have much support from the faithful at all. And so eventually the Russian diocese won the court case, but there was another split that was happening, and the leader of the largest of the Metropolitan of the American diocese decided to split from the Russian bishops in Serbia. And
Why is this?
because I don't know why actually. I think probably because of the monarchist stand, and the Americans really, for the most part, the American Church had very few monarchists and a whole lot of Slovakian peasants who were anti-monarchist, so, but they kind of went back and forth a bit. In 1935, the Patriarchate sent a bishop over to try and reconcile the American Church to the Moscow Patriarchate. Well, he required a loyalty oath by the clergy to the Soviet government. That didn't fly, to say the least. Although there were a few churches that accepted it, and that's the origin of the jurisdiction called the Moscow Patriarchal parishes in America. Okay, with Benjamin Fedchenko was the bishop. Then the American diocese went back into union with the bishops in the Karlovy bishops, and then in 1946, after the Second World War, during the Second World War, Stalin had reconciled with the church to some degree. He opened thousands of churches. He let the believers free. He'd martyred tens of millions of people, of Christians. He butchered hundreds of thousands of clergy and monastics and faithful, and then he lets the church free. He did that to try to rally the morale of the people, because it started with the Germans in the siege of Moscow, and he realized that he had to rally the morale of the people, otherwise they were just going to give in or give up. And so he had the Kazan icon taken in procession around Moscow. And
Did he claim to be a Christian?
I don't know if he ever did.
I mean, he grew up in a seminary, so
He was a seminarian, but he got thrown
yes,
out.
he was baptized Orthodox.
Yeah, he was baptized Orthodox,
He was a
and he had an Orthodox funeral.
Hmm.
Actually,
What was it?
Stalin,
Stalin.
He had an Orthodox
Yeah.
funeral.
Wow.
or at least he had a panikhida, Orthodox panikhida. And it's said that also that even Lenin called a bishop to his bedside
Yes, that's right.
as he was dying.
Weird.
It's weird, here they butcher the church, and
They're like, I'm
God-
in trouble.
God grant that they repent. But so anyway, the church in Russia was getting its feet on the ground. Monasteries were returned and opened, and there was this kind of minor flowering in the late 40s, which ran through into the early 50s until Stalin died and Khrushchev started again a bitter persecution of the church. But in the American Metropolia, they decided that, well, maybe this is a chance to resume a relationship with the new patriarch of Moscow. But the bishops of Karlovci were absolutely dead set against it. And so
Where's Karlovci?
that's where the Serbian bishops,
Oh,
they're the bishops in Serbia.
okay.
And so a split arose that ultimately was only healed a couple of years ago between what became the American Metropolia and the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. There were some parishes of the Russian Church outside of Russia in America that were not under the Metropolia. The more Russian and Tsarist parishes, a few scattered all across. But in 1950, the headquarters of ROCOR left Karlovci and moved to New York, to 93rd Street, where they are today, 93rd and Park. They were given a big old mansion. And there was this kind of there was communion, but kind of a toleration of one another between the ROCOR and the Metropolia. In 1970, this Metropolia, which was much larger than because of all of those unions that it had received, negotiated a deal with Moscow to recognize the Patriarchate of Moscow. Up until this time, they were in schism from the Russian Orthodox Church, from the Patriarchate. And in 1970, the Russian Metropolia, which was one of the heirs of the Russian mission, became the Orthodox Church in America, and was given autocephaly, which means total independence, but with mutual recognition. The ROCOR did not withdrew from communion with the OCA, as it had also withdrawn from communion with the Moscow Patriarchate, because it saw what the OCA's creation as a capitulation to the communists, and basically that lasted up until about 5 years ago, when there was when ROCOR reconciled with Moscow and restored communion, and then it took a couple of years, but then ROCOR and the OCA reconciled. That was Metropolitan Hilarion and I, as leader of the OCA.
Wow.
So it was a very interesting period in the history of the church. The
relations are still good.
the relations are still good. Thank God. I don't think they're going to break again. God willing. God willing. So, where are we? There are three heirs of the Russian mission. There's Rokor, there's the OCA, and there's the Moscow Patriarchal Parishes. Moscow Patriarchal Parishes is 30 parishes that remained under Moscow and were not given to the OCA when the OCA was created because they didn't want to go. The rest of the OCA, the rest of the Moscow Patriarchal churches went into the OCA. But it's a very small church and is actually prohibited from creating more churches.
What is OCA?
The Moscow Patriarchal Parishes.
Are they predominantly Russian now? Or are
No, they're
a mixture?
They're actually, well, I was received initially in the Moscow Patriarchal Parishes with a Mexican priest and a Palestinian congregation, and and they're basically, some of the parishes are Russian, most of them are convert parishes with convert priests, and they're all English. The Rokor is not just in America, but it's all over the world.
What does Rokor mean?
Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. And Metropolitan Hilarion, who was here on Sunday, is the Metropolitan who's the chairman of the Synod. He's the Metropolitan who...
What's a Synod?
It's the group of bishops that governs the church.
Oh.
And he's... there are bishops in Europe, there are Rokor bishops and parishes in Europe, there are Rokor bishops and parishes in South America and in Australia, New Zealand, and a few scattered other ways. But the strongest group of Rokor communities is in North America. I think there are four dioceses and 6 bishops or thereabouts. The OCA has 13 dioceses. It has about 600 parishes. Rokor has about 250 parishes in America. All 3 communities are part of the larger context of the Orthodox community in North America. Now, each of the jurisdictions has its own history. I talked about the Greeks. They started early too, but they didn't have any ecclesiastical organization with bishops until the 1920s, whereas the Russians started in 1840s with a bishop in Sitka.
What's the connection between the Russian and the Greek Orthodox?
Internationally, they're churches in communion with one another. Orthodoxy, the way Orthodoxy is organized is that each nation basically has its own bishops, its own synod of bishops. That's all the bishops in that country, with one head, who's called either a patriarch or a metropolitan or an archbishop, depending on the size and the history of that particular church. You have 4 ancient historical patriarchates. Constantinople is first, Alexandria in Africa, Egypt is second, Antioch, which is where the headquarters is really Damascus in Syria, and Jerusalem. Those are the 4 ancient patriarchates. Okay. Then there are other ancient churches, such as Georgia, and which have their own, patriarch and have their own have their own life. Then there are the churches that the national churches that formed during the Middle Ages. Oh, Cyprus also kind of fits in there, but it's not on the level of a patriarchate.
Okay.
It's an autocephalous church. So the Serbs and the Romanians and the Bulgarians are all ancient, churches from around the year 900 to 1000, and the Russians. The Russians occupy the 5th place in the order. And there's a whole ordering of.
Okay.
Then you have some of the later missionary churches that came out of later missions. For example, the church in Czech lands in Slovakia. Of course, that's part of it is very ancient, but going back to the 8th century, and part of it is much more modern. Church in Poland, that comes from the border moving, and there were all these Russian Orthodox who found themselves in Poland, or Ukrainian Orthodox, I guess you would call them. So there are 14 local churches, plus the OCA, which also claims autocephaly, but that's not recognized universally, the autocephaly. And then beyond that, there are autonomous churches, which have a lesser degree of independence from their mother church. For example, the Church of Japan is an autonomous church under Moscow. Although for a time after World War II, it was under the OCA, thanks to MacArthur. The Russians had an Ober Procurator. We had MacArthur. And they had American bishops in Japan up until the 1970s, from the 40s through the 70s. But the history of the Church of Japan is fascinating. One missionary, Saint Nikolai, went over there as to be a priest in the embassy, and started talking to people. His first convert was actually a samurai who was sent to kill him.
Nick Kozar sent me the story on that. It was fascinating.
Yeah,
that's crazy.
So now there are 150 churches, and it's services are all in Japanese. It's an all Japanese hierarchy. It's an all Japanese church. Ukraine is an autonomous church. It's not autocephalous, but it still is dependent on Moscow, and various others, in various places.
So if it's autonomous, why is it dependent on Moscow?
The autocephaly is full independence.
Full independence.
Okay. Autonomy means that the election of the primate, of the archbishop or metropolitan or archbishop or metropolitan, has to be approved by the mother church.
I see.
Yeah. Usually. There's another thing that is unique to an autocephalous church, usually, and that's that it makes its own chrism. Only the head of an autocephalous church can make chrism. In America,
but based on the same traditional way of makeup of the chrism.
Identical.
Okay.
Yeah. Same recipe as everybody else uses in the Orthodox world.
I see.
Yeah. That's something that we can go into in some detail. Since as head of the OCI, I made chrism, which is quite consecrated, fascinating thing. So in America, there are also about 12 or 15 jurisdictions. Over the past 20 years, there's been a lot of healing going on within the church. because almost all the churches that came from the Balkan countries had split over the anti-communist and those who accepted the hierarchy that was under communist domination. So there were 2 Serbian churches, there were 2 Romanian churches, there were 2 Bulgarian churches, there were 2 Antiochian churches, but not over that issue. That was more personality. 3 Russian churches, so the Serbs have gotten back together, the Antiochians have gotten back together, the Bulgarians have gotten back together, the Ukrainians are a mess. The Ukrainians went under the Greeks, and there's also another group of unions that came in that didn't go under the Russians; they went under the Greeks. That's called the Carpatho-Russian Archdiocese in America. And now there's a movement, as of the past 5 years, called the Shambhazi process, to pull all of the Orthodox churches together into a single unified whole. There's various opinions about that within the Orthodox community. Most of the bishops are horrified, one way or the other.
So they would want to have like one patriarch over
One
world?
patriarch in America,
Oh.
one regional. So that the church can be organized in the normal way that the Orthodox Church is organized. What we have now with all these multiple overlapping jurisdictions is wrong and uncanonical. But it's taken 100 years to evolve.
What's wrong about it?
According to Orthodox ecclesiology, you have no such thing as overlapping jurisdictions. You have one bishop in each city, and they sit together in a synod, but the bishop of one city can't even go into the territory of the other
Right now.
without notifying him.
Well, that's the same in New York City, isn't it?
Well, that's the Universal Orthodox
Oh,
pattern.
okay.
So, for example, the Patriarch of Moscow cannot go into the Diocese of St. Petersburg unless he's invited by the Metropolitan of St. Petersburg.
And that's good?
Yeah, that's what it is. It just is order. It preserves order within the church. In other words, he can't go and mess in somebody else's diocese. And this is one of the reasons that we remain separate from the Roman Catholics. Because
It's decentralized.
Well, it's not only decentralized, but the Catholics have a doctrine, which they elevate to the level of a dogma, of the universal jurisdiction of the Pope. Now, that means that the Pope has universal personal jurisdiction over every Catholic. That he doesn't have to pay attention to any pastoral boundaries, any diocesan boundaries. He has personal jurisdiction over every church and every priest and every layman. The Orthodox see that as a total abrogation of the apostolic order, which is, we have the apostolic order that was given by the apostles and has been continued ever since, and we're not going to change. They changed it, they can change it back, but that's actually the biggest issue between us and the Roman Catholics.
Because, correct me if I'm wrong, the Orthodox still consider him the first among equals, correct?
Well, but he doesn't.
Were he to enter back into that kind of...
Right.
I see.
Right. In other words, total collegiality.
Mm-hmm.
He has primacy. We don't have any issue with primacy. We have no issue with primacy of Rome. What we have issue with is the nature of how they interpret that, which is universal jurisdiction. Then there's all these other little things, but they're insignificant in reality.
And that conflicts with the relationship that Paul and Peter had with the churches of their time, correct?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It also makes the Pope a kind of super bishop, and instead of being a bishop like everybody else. Now, the last couple of popes have been much more orthodox in their understanding, so hopefully they will move the Catholic Church, the Roman Church, back towards orthodoxy. That's what we're hoping.
That's what I was going to ask you. One question last week was, I was told that the last few popes have actually said that the filioque was negligible.
Right. Yeah, filioque is basically a dead issue. They still have to remove it from the creed that they say in their churches, but it's a dead issue. Theologically, it's a dead issue.
So if it came down to that, they would probably be able to.
No, they essentially said that the Orthodox are right. And most of their theologians, I think, would actually say, if they don't have the Vatican breathing down on them, that the Orthodox are right so far as the jurisdiction goes. Then all the other stuff is basically either local custom or local aberration. Anyway, so in America, they're trying to pull the Orthodox all together into a single entity, and this is in view of a council that's supposed to be convened by the Patriarch of Constantinople in 2016, so that the Church in America can participate as a single church, and that's canonically organized, instead of this mishmash of jurisdictions, all of which are confused and overlapping.
You have to put the calendar together.
Oh, there's a whole lot of issues. Actually, the Romans are ready to give in on the issue of the calendar as well, and accept the Orthodox reckoning of Pascha.
The Pascha is okay. What about Christmas?
The Pascha is the real issue. And Christmas, it's the old calendar, new calendar. Christmas still falls on December 25th, regardless. The question is, when does December 25th fall? It's the date of Pascha that's the real issue.
I mean, that has to do something with the Jewish, right?
Partly it does, but for the most part, it's differences in the way that it's calculated, and the difference between the old calendar and new calendar. So, but none of that's on a dogmatic level. It's just a matter of practice. So there's some real issues between the Romans and the Orthodox, but there's definitely a kind of a rapprochement. Now, between the Orthodox is a different story.
Stop using the words.
What is it? Sorry to interrupt you, Vlad. What is a rapprochement?
Coming together.
I see. Is
It's
that
French?
It's French.
Yes.
Huh. That's a new one.
Yeah. Like reapproachment.
Oh, reapproachment. I see.
Rapprochement.
Rapprochement.
And so it's we're kind of the stage of sniffing each other, kind of getting that, feeling each other out to where we, how we stand. Rokor has issued a statement along with, I think, the Bulgarian Church that we don't believe that we're ready in America for a united church.
We as bishops, or
The
we
bishops.
as
One of the probably talk about that at some point.
Isn't the OCA against it?
I don't know what the OCA wants to do. No. One of the aspects of when it talks about all these councils of the church, going back to the ecumenical councils and even before that, as well as councils ever since. They're councils of bishops. And one of the things that the Episcopal ordination does is that people are ordained bishops and they're given the charism, the gift of the Holy Spirit, and the responsibility and authority to make the decisions for the rest of the body. Because the bishop embodies, he recapitulates his whole church within himself. And so the bishop is ordained by the Holy Spirit to make those kind of decisions. And it's bishops coming together in council from the very beginning that has been the decision-making capacity within the church. And so some of the reformists want to include priests and lay people in those councils, but that's not the Orthodox pattern. The Orthodox pattern, the Orthodox way, is that it's bishops who make the decisions because they're ordained to do that, and these other people are not ordained to do that.
Do they talk to the people, or do they just listen to the Holy Spirit? Or how do they make decisions?
Usually they talk to the people, but sometimes they'll go with what the people, their advisors say, and sometimes they won't. It's they listen to the Holy Spirit.
To make a decision, you need all the bishops to say the same thing, or you have a quorum.
It's usually by consensus of the bishops. That's the ideal within Orthodoxy. It's not democracy.
It's not democracy.
Yeah, it's consensus, and very often a synod will not make a decision unless there's unanimity among the bishops. So, if the bishops are fighting with one another, then the church is paralyzed. So, okay, I've held you a long time tonight.
It's going to take a while.
Thank you very much for holding this for a long.
Oh. So, we've got 10 minutes until 10 o'clock. Are there any questions?
Off the top of my head.
It's kind of a long monologue. But
How do you remember all of that?
I wrote down a lot of it.
We have a meeting next Monday?
No, we're in a hiatus now for about until the beginning of October 11th or something like that. Because we get back 8th. That's Thursday.
Wednesday.
Whatever that Wednesday, whatever that next Monday is when we'll meet again. The 11th or 12th or 13th.
We'll do the 13th.
Yeah, we'll be in
What about in St.
Moscow.
You will be?
Yeah,
Oh boy.
definitely.
Moscow.
And St. Petersburg, and even better yet, in Valom.
Are you going to take a lot of pictures?
Oh yeah.
Is it vacation time?
Yeah.
So when do you leave?
Monday.
Oh, so you'll have a meeting in St. Mark on Friday?
On Friday, yes, on St. Mark's.
Mhm.
And then, again,
That will be on Friday.
yeah, actually we won't meet on the, 11th or something like that, because I've got to go to, or maybe we won't. I've got to look at my calendar. But it'll either be, I think it's maybe the 10th or something like that. We'll meet at St. Mark's.
This Friday, though, St. Mark's.
This is Friday, St. Mark's, and we're going to finish off Romans.
Oh.
And we'll start a new series at St. Mark's too.
What do you think that would be?
I'm taking suggestions.
Okay.
So when would it come?
Is that October? Okay, yeah. So I think St. Mark's on the 10th. On the 10th is the next meeting. 11th and 12th I'm gone, but we'll be here on the 13th. And we can all celebrate my birthday on the 20th. So I'll bring a cake or something.
You have to bring a cake for your own birthday? When's
Unless
your
somebody
birthday?
would, yeah, the
When
20th.
is it?
We'll get you a cake.
Okay,
Yeah. Just remind us
okay.
in advance.
20th of October.
Of October.
October.
So, shall we pray?
Yeah.
Now that I've just announced all of the video listeners. It is truly meet to bless thee, O Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim, without corruption, who gave his birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify thee. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for mankind.
Peaceful
Always
and
now and
best
forever.